Welcome to Syncreate, a show where we explore the intersections between creativity, psychology, and spirituality. We believe everyone has the capacity to be creative, and our goal is to demystify the process and expand the boundaries of what it means to be creative. I'm Melinda Rothaus, and I help individuals and organizations bring their dreams and visions to life. At Syncreate, we're here to support your creativity. So if you have an idea or a project and you're not quite sure how to get it off the ground, please reach out to us. We've got resources, coaching, and creative process tools to help bring your work to the world. So I am very delighted today to have our guest, Johnny Juste, coming in from Boston today. And want to just go ahead and read your bio because I found it so compelling. So Jimmy, an unwavering seeker of uncharted territories, ignites insightful discussions with straightforward queries. Embracing a 9-year journey in Montessori spaces, he excels at disrupting and reshaping cultural norms as a seasoned consultant and facilitator. Jimmy's influence extends to over 30 organizations across Massachusetts and the wider U.S. At the core of his practice lies the liberation of self, employing diverse methods from somatic work to hypnosis and facilitative mediation. Facilitation, a transformative modality for meaning-making, empowers participants to express themselves authentically and boldly. Being a living commitment to imagination involves silencing the world enough to heed the soft, authoritative voice, reminding individuals of their essence and purpose. So, there's so much there. I just love it. Actually, there's so much to unpack there, right? So just to say number one, welcome. So happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. And just, less formally. So we met a few months back in March at the Florida Creativity Conference. Mm-hmm. And I attended your session on conscious facilitation, which I really loved. And, you just bring this really powerful yet calm presence to your facilitation work, and you gave us all a taste of it at the conference. And so I hope we can, kind of extend that to our listeners and viewers today. Yeah. And the topic of your presentation was conscious facilitation. So I think that's a great place just to jump in. So for people who may not know, what is conscious facilitation?
I think if you asked any facilitator, they would say that my definition of conscious facilitation is the same definition as facilitation.
Okay.
I think I call it conscious facilitation because I think it communicates to people who are not familiar with facilitation that there is some consciousness and awareness to playing the role of facilitator.
Yes.
So I think for me and for many other people who practice this, so I in no way do I think what I'm doing is special. I'm just doing it in a way that makes it really transparent for the participants. I think it means that you're holding space and you're using yourself as an instrument to read what's happening in the room.
Yeah.
So I think you are just more aware of how things affect you, even things that we would normally take for granted, and use them to sort of paint an imagery of what other people in that very same room are experiencing.
Yeah. So there's a lot of sensing into the environment, sensing into what's going on with people. And for example, what are some of the contexts in which you use this type of facilitation?
Yeah. Normally when I'm hired to work with a group, it's all, I would say maybe 60% of the time, it's to work with groups post some sort of conflict that they've been experiencing.
Right.
So usually what happens is this conflict has been sort of like normalized over time.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's coming to a head, and they're beginning to realize that they need help to figure out what to do next about this conflict. So
Yeah.
they're usually like, some shit has hit the fan, and they're hiring me to come in and sort of like, one, clean up the shit. Two, let's talk about what just happened, because there was shit everywhere.
Yes.
and
what happened there?
and
where do we go from here?
yeah, where are we going to go from here next? Like, how do we see each other differently? So I'm often in the space facilitating with people who are having a conversation about a thing that they've been actively avoiding.
Yes.
For long periods of time. And maybe some people have left. Maybe the people who like created the situation aren't there anymore. Like it can be really complex, and people are having different experiences of this very same conflict. For some people, this is crisis level, and for other people, this is regular shit. I don't know why this is a big deal to you.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to find, in that conversation where people don't really want to talk anyway, I have to use a lot more tools to be able to figure out what's the reality of this and what's at stake if this situation continues to persist.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like lots of things that I have to leverage in order for me to do it well. I got to learn how to listen in other ways besides the words that are coming out of people's mouths.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think something that you said at the beginning, about this, I sort of liken it. I think there's a component of emotional intelligence and, just being able to kind of see below the surface of what's going on in these kind of complicated dynamics. There's also, I know that you use a lot of grounding practices in your work, and you actually lead a grounding circle a couple times a month. So tell us a little bit more about some of those techniques and how that kind of comes into play, whether you're working with groups of people or individuals.
Yeah. So grounding practices, there was a time in my life, in my professional life and in my personal life, if sometimes the boundaries between personal and professional, sometimes they're permeable, sometimes
yes.
they're not. So the grounding practices were something that I had always engaged in, even as a child. Through the sort of spiritual practices that were passed down to me through the lineage of my family, like my father and my mother, things like prayer or things like lighting a candle, like things like that people wouldn't think of as a grounding practice. As I explored my spirituality, I realized that what I was doing with all those things they were all grounding practices. And so I realized, as I became more interested in the pursuit of learning facilitation, I realized, especially in these high frustration situations where we're having conversations, we have to figure out a way to deal with the excess energy that comes up.
Yes.
When we're either like talking about something that has built up a lot of energy over time, or something has triggered like an emotional response. So there is heightened energy in the space, or a conflict has happened in the midst of talking about something else. So now there's more energy in the space because things are vibrating in ways that we can't necessarily control.
Yeah.
So there is some energetic disorder happening in the room. And so the grounding practices, things like stopping and breathing, or doing a short meditation, or even just like when they say take a deep breath, when things are really starting to go south, and they say just take a deep breath. All those things are grounding practices. Some of them are symbolic and some of them are not. Some of them are physiological and some of them are mind spirit type of work. So in facilitation, I tend to do a lot of grounding practices that are small and don't really trigger the like symbolic networks in our brain that make us think this is a little bit woo-woo and I'm checked out now.
Yeah.
So sometimes those things just look like a an icebreaker before we get started.
Yeah.
To like maybe just sort out what's happening in the brain and get you ready for the thing that we're about to do next. To get you to practice the thing that we're going to do when the stakes are higher. So grounding can happen in two ways. Sometimes it's the sorting through what's happening in the mind or what's happening in the body and just putting things in a proper place so you can make room to do the thing that you want to do. And sometimes it's getting rid of whatever is excess and taking up space because you haven't figured out where to put it. And so grounding practices are really about, essentially, in a nutshell, figuring out what to do with excess energy when there's too much of it and you can't control it and it's making more chaos and disorder. That isn't particularly helpful. It's figuring out what to do with the extra.
Yeah. I love that way of looking at it, right? It's just, okay, it's not, there's like no judgment on it. It's just an excess of energy. And how do we work with that when things get really heightened or there's conflict or people are nervous or whatever it might be.
I think one of the things that I find people do who aren't really familiar with like what the purpose of grounding is, when you think about grounding is just about clearing space or making space or dealing with excess energy. But sometimes people who really don't have a really deep understanding of what grounding is, they might use it to like sterilize the situation. Like, so they'll be like, let's just take a deep breath so we can like make this clean again and not deal with what's happening.
Right.
But that's not what grounding is. Grounding is not that. Grounding is clearing space. Everything is what it is. There is no judgment. We're just clearing space so we can choose what we want to do in this like heightened situation.
Coming back to the conscious part, like, you know, it reminds me of that Viktor Frankl quote, you know, between stimulus and response, there's a space, right?
Right.
And in that space, that's where we can make a choice instead of just reacting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I love this and, you know, definitely want to hear more about like how you work with groups on this. But given the fact that the show's about creativity and we met at a creativity conference, I'm curious how you see the creativity in your work or how it relates to creativity.
Yeah. It relates to creativity because, like I said, I'm usually working with groups that are like in a heightened state, and they need to, and they don't want to be in the problem state anymore. They want to be in a future state.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're asking me to tell them what the answer is to get to the future state. And sometimes they ask me to do that, and I usually tell them no. That's not what I'm here for.
Right.
I would make a ton more money if I just
could just solve all the problems.
If I just I'm just gonna tell you what to do. Like I've seen this before, but it never works. Like if I just tell you what to do, it never actually solved the problem because it doesn't have as much energy as there would be if there was buy-in.
Right.
And through all creative processes that have been formalized, you are building buy-in throughout the entire process because people are diverging and then converging, and converging. And in some way, that is the sort of the coalition building and then the consensus building, coalition building and then the consensus building.
Yeah.
And there's so much at stake because these people are all really motivated not to be in the problem state anymore because it sucks for them. So they need to do two things. They need to figure out what the problem state is and why it exists.
Right. And sometimes that can be challenging unto itself, just defining the problem. Like, what is the issue here actually like at the heart of it?
Right.
Right.
Right. And that sometimes is the most, can be, depending upon where a group is, that can sometimes be the most contentious. It's like naming the problem because that's when resistance comes up. Like, I don't want to name the problem that because it implicates me in this way. Right. So the naming the problem can become where the grounding practices are really helpful because it helps us stay. It's a mechanism that I can use and participants can use to help them stay on their purpose.
Yeah.
and sort of
Yeah.
clear out the distractions.
Yeah. And then once you've defined the problem, then
We have to converge on what it would look like, and then we have to converge on how we would get there, because they're building the solutions. If I'm playing the role of facilitator with a group, the solution doesn't come from me. I'm walking you through a process where you get to your solution.
yes. And that's so important that whatever's going on, whatever the group is, that they feel ownership, right?
Mhm.
And that they're willing to engage and take responsibility for the solution.
Yeah. So I mean, it's very deeply tied to what we know works in creative processes. It just doesn't always look like Post-its on a wall,
Right.
which is like what you see
here's
a lot
the
of.
formula for how you solve the creative problem. Right?
Yeah. And all those are great. They're really helpful.
Yeah.
Like for mapping out, if we want to look at, some version of qualitative or quantitative data, those things are really helpful.
Sure.
But there's also an instrument that is experiencing all those things that are on those stickies.
Yes.
There are people and experiences that are happening that need to be processed.
And emotions, and maybe people are getting triggered by stuff that happened in the past. That's like something in the present is resonating. So there's like so much complexity with like what each person is bringing to the table.
Yeah.
In a moment of conflict.
Yeah.
Right.
And all those things need to be, they need to be catalyzed. They need to be used so that it doesn't creep up again and as something different.
Yeah.
It's got to have the opportunity. And that's what facilitation does. It creates the space for you to take that experience and make meaning of it, and then use the meaning that you got from that experience, as opposed to that experience haunting you in all your decision making.
Right. And that's what I think is so powerful. Like if we want to bring in more the like psychology, spirituality side of things, creativity is a way that we can make meaning, just as you're saying, of our experiences, right? And if we can make meaning of our experiences, then we can learn and grow from them. Right. And again, make a different choice.
Yeah.
The next
Otherwise,
time.
we end up with more clutter. We just end up with a bunch of ideas, which is why, in creative processes, there's the divergence and the convergence. Like you get all the clutter of all the ideas, and then you have to figure out how to make meaning of them. Where do you find the most meaning? What's the most high leverage direction we can move towards?
Yes. And then how do we take meaningful action on that?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so one of the things we talked about when we were kind of thinking about this conversation was, this, how important it is to help people stay present when things get really difficult, and like having those difficult conversations. So say more about that, because I just thought that was a really powerful element of this work.
Yeah, it's a really powerful element, and it's probably the most challenging.
Yes.
And requires the most consciousness.
Yes.
This is where I think getting people to stay in the room when things get challenging is becomes a challenge for the facilitator, for the practitioner who's in charge of holding the space, in charge of shepherding the purpose of why we're all in a room together. Because money's involved a lot of the time. You, as a facilitator, have to check your biases. And the only way you can absolutely check your biases is if you are paying attention as much to everyone else as you are to yourself. So you're sort of like splitting your awareness when you're holding the role of facilitator. That's fucking hard.
Because you're probably, physiologically responding to like, this person's angry, this person's not saying anything, this person's really agitated. Like you're holding all of that. And you're also trying to facilitate a dialogue, right?
Yeah. And the world teaches us to do one of two things: either cut everyone else off and only pay attention to yourself.
Yeah.
Play your role, stay in your lane.
Yeah.
Or cut yourself off from yourself and pay attention to everyone else.
Right. And just focus everything outward. Yeah.
So there has to be, in order for you to like responsibly play the role of facilitator, you have to be figuring out ways to watch both.
Yeah.
And for some people, that means like bifurcating your attention. Like, this is where I'm going to pay attention to me, and this is where I'm going to pay attention to them. Sometimes it's about building the muscles that you need, sort of like I always think of like jujitsu, where there's grappling and holding, and there's like a negotiating between muscles to hold the position.
Yeah.
Like there's also that, like, paying attention to all the muscles that are required to hold a dual awareness of what's happening with you, what's happening with them, and what does it mean for them, everything that you're experiencing from them, and what does it mean for me, everything that I'm experiencing with me, while also keeping an eye on how they're interplaying with each other.
Yes. Right. Because you're, even as a facilitator, you're part of the context. You're part of the equation at that point, right? You're not just an outside objective, you're in it. Yeah. And I think there's wisdom that, anyone could take from that, because we're all facilitating in different ways, in different contexts all the time, or at least we have the potential, whether that's in our families, our personal relationships, right? Work situations. And so, I think it definitely comes back to that, self-awareness. What am I feeling? What's happening inside my mind and my body? What's going on with, the other people in this situation, and how do we communicate in a way that's productive?
Yeah. And all of that is sort of giving you information of what you think people need so that they'll stay as it gets harder.
Yeah. So I think this is all such great stuff, and we're talking about it like a little bit abstractly. So I'm curious, like, is there a particular example that you might be able to relate, like whether it comes from your kind of Montessori background or facilitation, where, we could kind of see this process at work?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. I love that, because it's going to force me to really like think about this. So I would say there are lots of technical practices that I use in connection with each other. NLP, for example, neuro-linguistic processing has been a really interesting tool for me, because how I communicate to the group is largely going to be influenced by the words that I use.
Yes.
And the words that I use are going to point them in a direction that I think would be helpful for the group. And also in watching them, and like, what's the syntax that they're using, and what kind of sense is it giving me of what's happening with this group and what they need and what they want. And what words can I offer to that pool of language that will also have an effect on how they're feeling about what's happening in the room and what's possible. So neuro-linguistic programming is one example of how I can use or listen to their words to let that tell me or give me impressions about what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
And then I could use that in turn to affect them in the ways that I think would be helpful. And a hard example of what that looks like, there's this activity that I like to do with folks, where I give them a sort of ethical dilemma. And at the end of this ethical dilemma, a woman dies, and they have to decide who's responsible for this woman's death.
Oh, wow.
And so I can ask the question, who's to blame for this woman's death? Or I could ask the question, who's responsible for this woman's death? Those two things are likely, not totally, it's not guaranteed, but they are likely to elicit different responses from the group.
Interesting.
If I say, who's to blame
Right.
for the death versus who's responsible for the death. Because for me as a facilitator, blame implies relationship. Blame implies social contract.
And judgment.
Responsibility implies power, implies structure, implies all of these things that will elicit different kinds of responses from the group.
Yeah.
And different kinds of interactions with each other. So that's an example of how like neurolinguistic programming can like play, is a technical tool that you can use to help give you impressions of what's happening.
Yes. And actually, on that note, it's interesting. What occurred to me when you were describing that is I would imagine, depending on the group and the context and the composition of who's in the room, you know, people may be communicating very differently, right? And like, do you have to adjust how you're communicating based on the particular group that you're working with?
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah.
There's this one tool that I teach. It's intercultural conflict styles and communication styles.
Yes.
But so a lot of the time I'm working in DEI spaces.
Yeah.
So we're either having conversations about race or gender, or power dynamics in general. So identity plays a role in all those things. And there are styles to how we engage in conflict and styles for how we communicate.
Yeah.
Now, in most working spaces, they are going to be high on directness and high and very low on emotional expressiveness.
Yeah.
So that's what's considered, like in American society, is what considered
workplace.
Yeah,
behavior.
workplace. Yeah, like professional.
Yeah.
That wasn't professional.
Right.
Very often when people are saying that wasn't professional,
right,
or I need you to be professional, they're saying
there's too much emotion. Yeah.
Right. There's too much emotion is what they're talking about. Like, we are low emotional expressive, high directness.
Yeah.
So there are certain styles and there are certain expectations for people who don't communicate in those styles.
Yeah.
So if I am low on emotional expressiveness and high in directness in my delivery, they're going to assume that the way that I'm communicating is allowing whatever culture is there to persist.
Yeah.
But I might come in with a different style to invite more openness, invite more emotional expressiveness, because I need that data to figure out what's happening.
Right.
So I'm going to use a different style, or I might use a very high emotional expressiveness with high directness because it's compatible with the high directness of American workplaces. But I might be really expressive and use my hands and my body language a lot and show my palms to create and foster more openness in the subconscious mind.
Yeah.
And invite them to participate in different kinds of data gifting to one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's pulling all those things together.
Yeah. And are there some other techniques that you bring in as well?
Yeah. There's one tool that I am familiar with that I like to use, especially if I'm doing observations of groups. So if I'm in discovery with a client, because they've come to me to do some facilitation about a problem and they want me to see the problem before we go into figuring out how to problem solve it. I will use this tool called structural dynamics, which is like mapping out the different kinds of talk moves that people use in conversation. So it's this idea that there are only 4 vocal expressions in language. There's a move, a bystand, a follow, move, a bystand, a follow, and there's a 4th one that I can't remember. But you can use these tools to sort of map out what these vocal expressions are and see what patterns repeat themselves in a group. So it's sort of like coding people's language over time and seeing what emerges and what structures are there. What do people engage in? Why do they engage in these patterns?
And are those styles, you mentioned power dynamics. So I would imagine those communication styles are related with power
Yeah,
dynamics.
yeah.
Yeah.
They definitely inform each other, and there are patterns. Like most leaders tend to be, tend to live in directness. They also tend to live in more optimism, generally speaking, than most other folks who play different roles.
Yeah.
So that like there are patterns to how people show up when they're playing those roles for long periods of time. And what's interesting is when those patterns don't persist, what does it tell you?
Yeah. 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 So is there an example maybe of a group that you've, and not to name any names or anything, but just trying to get at the dynamics of this, a group maybe that comes to mind that you've worked with where you were able to walk them through this facilitation process and they were able to find their way
Yeah.
to a really positive solution from beginning with a really sticky situation. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one example that I'm thinking of that happened recently within an agency that I've been working with for about a year now. And the nature of their work is conflict. They shelter families that are going through high stress crisis situations. So they're constantly sort of like processing and catalyzing conflict.
Yes.
And so when they're working with each other, it's helpful to have me, who they've hired to be just sort of be like a person who participates but is not involved in their work. I'm just hired to sort of be there and listen and to name what I see, and then maybe they can decide what they want to do with my observation. They were they had just decided on some new norms for working together, and one of the norms is that no decision should be made outside of the managers group unless it's been discussed with the managers. But something went down, like there were people away at conferences and some people were homesick, and so a decision needed to be made about something really quickly, and all the parties and stakeholders were not present for this new norm that they had just enacted. And so they went ahead and made the decision, and there were a bunch of people who really would have wanted to be a part of that decision that were not there. And they were pissed because the whole reason that they enacted this rule was because the people who weren't there, they made a decision the last time without the rest of them.
Right.
And they were pissed. And they were like, you just gave me all this shit.
Yeah.
And you just did what you
did the thing.
You did the thing that I got in trouble for last time. You just did. And so I'm watching them talk about this because I've been working with them for years, so there's a lot of trust. So like if I'm in the room, they just have their meeting and like I'm not there. And so I'm watching them sort of hash this out. And they seem the words that they were using was indicating that they had come to a solution, but they were still talking about the solution over and over and over and over. And I was like, I just want to notice that there's some incongruence. Like it's the words you're using are telling me that you've come to a solution, but the patterns through which you're speaking is as if somebody's not satisfied with this solution. So like, can you help me make sense of the incongruence here?
Yeah.
And so they then figured out that they had to like talk about how it made them feel, the fact that this pattern had happened. That was what they were.
And that was the unresolved part.
They didn't feel heard. They came to a solution, but there were people who did not feel heard. So they were still talking about it and looping over this thing that it seemed like they solved like 10 minutes ago. Yeah. And so just making that observation and giving it back to the group. And like, that's the using yourself as an instrument. It's like, I'm feeling these things happening that don't seem to be making sense together. I'm not going to say what it means, but I'm going to give it to the group and see if you can figure out what this looks like. Or why it exists.
And sometimes just being there as an observer and just naming what you're seeing helps them to see what they're not able to see from inside, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so cool. So I always like to, kind of try to find a way to like, bring these things home for people. So,
Mhm.
um, I like to do a creativity pro tip toward the end of each episode. It's like, okay, how can you take what we're talking about and put it into practice? So,
Uh-huh.
do you have any, like, maybe a practical tip for people who just find themselves in the midst of, there's conflict is inevitable, right? It's
Yeah, yeah.
always, can we always have chances to practice? So, like, what's one thing, maybe a grounding practice or a facilitation tip that people could use to, next time they find themselves in a tense
Yeah.
situation?
Yeah. I would say for being in conflict, I would say the most helpful thing you do is probably the hardest is to never succumb to the need to move quickly
Uh huh.
and expect that a good, thoughtful, and nuanced answer is going to come from moving quickly.
Yeah.
Um, you've got to move slowly. Sometimes you have to move quickly, but don't expect that like the answer that came out of your awareness when you were moving quickly is going to be the answer that should persist. Like that answer might need to evolve and
Yes.
move through some meaning making, move through some creative processes before it really becomes something that's sustainable and thoughtful and takes into account all the stakeholders.
Yeah, I love that. I heard a phrase once actually at a meditation retreat, which is like speed produces aggression.
Uh-huh.
So, like, the antidote in my mind, one of my little mantras is when in doubt, slow down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that applies to conflict. That applies to creativity. Like, if you don't know how to proceed, maybe time to step back and like take a
Yeah.
little space from it, come back and maybe see the problem with fresh eyes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I love that. Just slowing down, taking space, not being like too hasty
Yeah.
to come to a solution.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other thing that I would give to people like in the moment, is people always use the phrase when they get upset, like just take a deep breath to sort of calm things down, which is actually as condescending as it sounds.
You're right.
When you hear it. It's actually what you should do when
Yes.
things get stressful. But there's a way to do it. And it isn't just about taking a deep breath, but there's a way to do it that can sort of get your nervous system back to sort of homeostasis
Uh-huh.
and allow you more access to like the executive network. And that's just taking 2 really quick breaths in and then let it sigh out.
Yeah.
Like dogs do this a lot.
Like,
Yeah.
yes.
Or babies do it when they're crying and they're calming down, like they're coming down from the peak of their tantrum
Yes.
and like
Yeah.
and they do that like slurp and come back down. That's their nervous system like calming itself down.
Yeah.
You can do that in moments where you're like, I am feeling more disembodied than I would normally be. You can bring yourself back or closer to homeostasis and make it much easier for you to like transition to like the executive functioning that you need so that you can decide what happens next and not react to what happens next.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. So we're kind of getting toward time, but I just wanted to sort of open it up here at the end, is if there's one message that you'd like to get out there to the world, to our audience, anything we haven't touched on yet, what would it be?
I would say I had a friend, a professional friend from a long time ago, who would hear me out when I was going through really challenging times. And she would say, you just got to show up.
Yes.
And I would say that for these, when you are in conflict with people for whom you care about, it's a really good idea to assess, like, do you care enough about the people that are in the room that you would show up when things are challenging?
Yeah.
Like, that's an important question to ask. I
For
would say
sure.
like asking that question pretty regularly, I think, is helpful.
Yeah. Like, am I willing to show up for this?
And that implies that like you should be willing to show up. That's not what I mean.
But maybe sometimes maybe sometimes you just got to walk away.
Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah.
You can be done.
Yeah.
That's helpful information.
That's right. Like there is always a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that so much. So, well, thank you so much. This has been great. And so if people want to connect with you, find out more about your work, how can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram. Johnny Juste is the handle. My website, www.nerveconsulting.com. I'm holding a facilitation training soon, July 29th to August 1st. It's going to be at the Brooks School in Andover, Massachusetts.
Great.
There's only 10 spots, so you can find that through Instagram and all the social medias.
Awesome. Love it. We're recording today at Record ATX Studios in Austin, Texas with Jimmy in Boston. Thanks again for being on the show. And the show is produced in collaboration with Mike Osborne at 14th Street Studios. If you enjoy the show, please connect with us. We're on social media, YouTube. Like, subscribe, and drop us a line. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.